Hi, Jeff. How's it going?
Good. How are you, Alex?
I'm excellent. It's mid-October already. Shocking but true. And we're joining everybody. We're joining each other, and we're joining everybody for episode. I need to start keeping track of this, but we're on an episode of School of Thought, which is our super casual, off-the-cuff, learning, explosive, informative podcast, all about how to sort of shift learning to be, how to shift education to be more supportive of children and human development. So it's always a pleasure and a gas to do this with you. How's your week been?
It's been a busy week, but a good one. I guess I could always say it's been a busy week. That's probably a
Yeah.
terrible term to use, but it's been good. It's been fruitful and full.
Fruitful.
Yes.
Oh,
How
I
about
like
you?
that. Oh, well, you said the word busy, and like that is the adjective that applies, definitely. I've been telling myself I refuse to use the word busy because it puts me, like it just makes me feel busy, right? And
Yeah.
overloaded. So I'm telling people I have a metaphor for how the fall feels, and I'm visualizing it as like a fast flowing river, really fast flowing river. Like there's lots going on, but I'm in the kayak, and I have a paddle, and I know what to do with the paddle. And so it's okay because sure, the river's fast, but there's gravel bars, right? And so I have this visual also of getting out of the kayak, out of the flow, and onto the gravel bar now and then, so that I can just pause and
Right.
like let the river flow. I got that image from Headspace a long time ago. Just watching the flow go by, and then when I'm ready to get back in the flow, I get back in the boat, and then off I go. So
That's great.
somehow, yeah, I know it has made me feel a little more in management of what's going on, because otherwise, yeah, I just feel like there is a lot going on.
Yep. Yeah, no,
Yep.
that's good. I like that. I like that.
Yeah.
Very good.
Yeah. So that's the metaphor I'm going with. But yeah, today we're gathered here today again to talk about one of the convictions that you have hammered out as part of the whole system of learning that you've adopted at your school, which is the Pacific School of Innovation and Inquiry. And we've made it through 8 so far. Our past episodes have taken people through 8 of the convictions that you have explained, and I've asked you all sorts of questions about. We're going to do the same thing today. Today we get to talk about assessment.
Big one.
It's a big one, yeah. Actually, I know this is a big one for you, especially. You've put a lot of time and energy over the years, and not just over your years of leading PSII, but also all of your years in the classroom and all of your years in administration. Assessment has been a really important focal point for you. So before I lay down the conviction, maybe tell me why has assessment been so important for you?
It's interesting. I was thinking about that leading up to this to say, why is it a conviction? Even like, well, how did it get to that top 20? But I think part of it is because it's done generally so poorly, and we've kind of fallen into, first of all, I think we've fallen into a trap where we think assessment and evaluation are the same thing. And that's one big problem. And then another one is, even if we are thinking about assessment, I think assessing learning is really hard, because often we find ourselves assessing performance that is used as an indicator of learning, but performance is performance. It's not learning. It's kind of like the Zen story of the finger pointing at the moon is not the moon itself, kind of a thing. Sometimes I think we're assessing a lot of fingers and we're not assessing a lot of moons. And so it's very tricky to make sure that what you think you are assessing is actually what you're assessing. It's hard.
This is cool. I want to go deep. I've already got a question. Are you surprised?
Hey, good.
Trust Alex to ask all the questions. Oh, I don't even think I introduced us today.
It's all right.
Well,
We'll
I'll
figure it out
back up.
by induction.
Oh yeah, that's true. You're Jeff. I'm Alex. You are a principal and a principal educator, and I am a questioner, a seeker, a learner, a parent, all kinds of things. Okay, so our the conviction as you've written it out is authentic and robust assessment of, for, and as learning is essential. So
Yeah.
you're looking at this through 3 different lenses: assessment of learning, assessment for learning, and assessment as learning.
Yeah.
So maybe if I get you to break those down, you might answer the question that I had. Well, the question I had right off the top was how are we confusing assessment and evaluation? So I'm imagining you'll sort that out when you tell us what the difference is of, for, and as.
Yeah, although I think that question actually could sort of stand on its own too, just that, assessing something should be providing feedback and giving somebody information about what you are witnessing or what they're engaged in. So it's not an evaluative statement as much as it is an informative statement. So sort of like if you go to the doctor and they give you a bunch of information, it may not always be about this is good or this is bad. Like if you go to an eye doctor, they say this is your prescription. You're like, thanks, now I can get glasses that work. Not if I went into the eye doctor and they said, you got an 85, and I'm like, 85 what? And they're like, 85. Just bye. You've been a pleasure to have in my office. Have a nice summer. And then and then you go, I don't know what kind of glasses to get. I don't have any information, but I know that I'm an 85, and I guess I could be better if I was an 86. So I think sometimes we forget that the information about something can be very specific to whatever kind of learning is happening, and it doesn't have to be an evaluative piece of information. It can just be informative.
Okay.
Often we jump to evaluation to tell people like kind of where they stand in some kind of a pecking order, as opposed to give me some information about what I'm learning, which is actually what we're supposed to be doing, I think, at school.
I think for the most part, classrooms skew toward the former. Like even when I think about my my time in the classroom, teaching grades 5 and 6, yeah, it was really about sort of measuring, right? And I will tell you honestly, back then my focus was not on how can I figure out what this child is learning and where her gaps are. It was how can I show where there's room for improvement, but in a numerical way, almost always in a numerical way. If it wasn't a rubric, it was a percentage. If it wasn't a percentage, it was a fraction, right?
Yep. Oh yeah, and we
So
quickly
this is widespread. So how do you shift the gears?
I mean, for us, I guess this is why this is a conviction too, which is, we have to shift the gears to giving people information that helps them learn better, and learn what they need, as opposed to good, try again and see what kind of number you get next time. Maybe it'll be higher. And even with a rubric, you can say to someone, here's the stuff that's kind of, would be the next step in the rubric, and that can be helpful and that can be part of assessment. But even that, if that just ends up being evaluative again, it can be a person doing something to try to see what is the criteria that someone has established for me to get a higher evaluation level, as opposed to what do I need to do to learn more, or learn better, or go from where I am to a better place. Hopefully the two are similar, but they aren't always. We do this in our systems as well. In the public school system especially, there are these yearly improvement kinds of contracts that districts do, which is you set targets and you say, here's where we are now, here's where we want to be next year. And quite often the numbers people choose for those targets are just kind of pulled out of thin air. Like, we had our people who can read by the age of 6, is 88%. We're going to try for 90% next year. And I always ask, like, well, so where did that come from? It's like, oh, it's higher than 88. But there's no real assessment of where did the 88 come from? How are you going to get to 90? What is it that you're doing to help people learn to read? Or are you just sampling what you see? Are you doing anything related to helping people learn to read? That would be the assessment part. But just picking a number and just saying we want the number to be higher than the last number, not to mention the fact that statistically there could be a margin of error around your numbers that could be bigger than the target that you've set. So if you went from 88 to 90, you may have actually gone backwards.
Right.
The margin of error could be bigger. So, it's just very, very quantitative. And I think it's because numbers are still mystical to most people. We kind of bow down to numbers. But the numbers have to come from somewhere and they have to stand for something.
Yeah. So, okay, how did it get this way? Like, what's your thesis on how education sort of became, barking up the wrong tree, pointing at the, what was that
Pointing at the
metaphor?
moon instead of the moon itself.
Yeah. So how did we get sort of off track with paying attention to the right things?
Well, I do think that at one time probably education wasn't so concerned about assessment as it was about evaluation, which was just sorting and sifting people, just saying who rises to the top. They're the people that are going to go on to, maybe they're the ones who are going to go on to the professions and everybody else is not, or something like that from way back in the day when that's how we used to think about things. So it probably really was just about mechanisms to sift and sort people.
And that's still operative today, though, right? I mean, like, if you think about university entrance, I haven't actually looked at, and you would be way more familiar with this than me because of your graduates who are looking at university entrance. But I hear from people's experiences that the marks just keep getting higher and higher. So it is a lot of sifting and sorting. You can't go to UBC for science unless you, or for nursing, unless you have a 96%. Like,
yeah. So then everybody who's going to nursing gets 96%. The grade inflation problem is really ridiculous. And those numbers are really, a university's attempt to say, well, if all you guys are going to do is give us numbers, then I guess we're going to make the numbers high. All they're doing is guessing at how many seats they think they're going to have and how many people they think are going to come churning out of the system with those marks. And they literally are just using a statistical analysis saying, 0.5% of people came out with these marks. That's about how much room we have. So that's the mark. And they're just taking their best guess to try to gatekeep. But yeah, you're right. We really have been doing an evaluative kind of model, and we still do to a large degree. And again, that, getting that 96% in, human physiology 12, well, what does that mean? Like, what are you good at? What are you not good at? What do you need to improve on? What are you comfortable with? What are your preferences? What have you learned? What have you mastered? Who knows? Like, can't tell from that information.
No, and so that points up the fact that we have a little bit of ground to cover, don't we? Like, I'm still thinking about university entrance, and the picture you're painting is the one that I also understand. In the absence of other meaningful attributes, learner attributes, universities almost are reduced to this reductionist approach to onboarding learners by just sort of looking at marks. And I mean, they're looking at extracurricular involvements as well, and a few things here and there like writing ability, but really kind of missing the richness of a fuller assessment.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you said it there too, which is, I think it is a reduction to something very simple. I think we've talked ourselves into thinking we should be able to give someone information in a single number or a very short bit of information, whereas we would never do that with something as complex as learning actually is. But we don't translate that from school into other things that are just as complex. Like, we wouldn't say, what's the score of the Brandenburg concertos? What is their score out of 100? We don't do that, because, like, what do you mean? There's so much to talk about there. Well, guess what? Same with how human beings learn things. We've just reduced our curriculum. We've reduced our evaluation of how people are learning so much that we sometimes just forget about assessment altogether, or we limit the assessment only to evaluative kinds of statements that are really simple and small, so we can pass it on to someone really easily, even though it could very well be wrong or just not really informative enough.
And when you think about the impact that approach has, like, even if you just winnow it down to one life, right? Like, you look at the life of one learner, and I'm thinking, this is in my mind right now because my grade 8 son is home with me. He chose to homeschool this year. And we were working on math today, and he's got a big emotional and mental block around math. And that is not because he doesn't have the ability to do computation and abstraction and, you know, and problem solving. It is down to the beliefs he has now taken on through a system that is sort of evaluation focused and sort of only capturing that very narrow reflection of who he is, basically, right? So not only are we getting an inaccurate picture of what a human's competencies are when they are at any point in their educational stream, you know, most especially when they're making the jump from grade 12 to post-sec, but we are like, that approach is it is not supportive of optimal human development, i.e. it gives the learner a belief about themselves, and then it installs a self-limiting, like a limiter, right? Like a car engine has a limiter. You can't go beyond 90 kilometers an hour. It's like people have these limiters inside them now that were acquired in childhood, that were acquired through almost an absurd process of having somebody give them an evaluation.
Yeah, a number of something. It's interesting what you talk about. Like, if someone is working on a math concept, and let's say they're using something that gives them a score. Let's say there were 20 questions and they got the first 5 wrong, and then they figured it out, and then the next 15 were correct. They've mastered the concept.
Right.
Their mark is going to be, you know, 15 out of 20. It's not going to be 100%. It's going to be 15 out of 20. It's going to look at everything they did, but they mastered the concept. So that number is useless. It doesn't have anything to do with assessment. It's only evaluation, and it's in a context that isn't really terrifically helpful. Someone else who figured it out after 1 question is going to get 19 out of 20. So they're going to look like they have a higher mark, but they have exactly the same level of mastery. Maybe not even as good as the person that got the first 5 wrong. There might be someone who did it 17 times and got the last 3 right and completely understands it. They fail, but they've mastered it. Like, so there's no assessment of someone's grasp of a concept. There's only a mathematical construction that comes from dividing a number by another number, which doesn't mean anything at all except mathematically.
Yeah. So, okay, so walk us through this conviction. You've said authentic and robust assessment of, for, and as learning is essential. Go. I'm giving you 3 minutes.
Okay. Here we go. Oh my gosh. Okay, here we go. I talk real fast. Auctioneer time. Well, in BC, we've been really lucky. There's been a very large assessment conversation over probably 20 years. It's kind of disappeared again, unfortunately. I'm not quite sure what happened, but I guess it's not the flavor of the week anymore, so it's gone. But we used to use this terminology in BC quite a bit. And the idea was assessment of learning is kind of the obvious, like just telling somebody how well they did and giving them some feedback that says, here's how well you did. We're assessing your learning. Assessment for learning is kind of the next, you know, richer, slightly more rich version of assessment, which is, I'm going to give you feedback, not to just tell you how you did, but to give you a sense of where you are, what that means to you, and how you could go deeper in your learning. So the assessment gives you something to work on. So, for example, instead of giving somebody, 8 out of 10 on a little essay they write, you might say to them, it looks like you really understand how to make paragraph to paragraph transitions, but you might want to work on having a consistent voice throughout the paper. And all of a sudden they're like, okay. And now they has some information of what they're going to work on to get better. So instead of just saying, I'll write another paper and see if I get 9, they actually know what they're trying to do. Now that was a quick example, but something like that. So the assessment for learning is about giving people feedback within the learning process, not after the learning process, to say, while you are learning this, here is some feedback for you that's going to allow you to learn this better than if I didn't give you the feedback.
So let me ask you there.
Yeah.
Sorry, I took off your last sentence. What were you saying?
So you're just saying, just doing it during the learning process instead of after it. That's all.
Okay, well then, so when I was marking essays, for example, I'm a professional writer now. So of course, English was a place where I felt like I could do some pretty good instruction. So I would be marking essays, and there would be a grade for sure, but also I would have, a fair amount of maybe bullet points at the bottom giving students some direction. Here's what you can do differently next time. Here's how you might try this, and I suggest doing this. So is that kind of in line with that assessment for learning? Like, I was evaluating, but
Yeah,
I was also giving some pointers about how to improve, how to get that voice, etc., for next time.
absolutely. And if you think about it, if you didn't give the mark and you only gave that feedback, I think what's funny is
Mm,
sometimes kids, especially, they'll look at the mark and then go, "Man, feedback," and they may or may not look at it. But if all they get is the
true.
feedback, they look at it. And if
That's
it's
interesting.
very, and if it's what we emphasize, which unfortunately we don't emphasize right now in school, we emphasize the numbers. If you look at a grade book, there's nowhere for feedback. There's just numbers. And I mean that's why we
That's
don't
true.
use grade books, because they're terrible. But they emphasize the wrong end of assessment. So you're absolutely right. That's a good example of a little bit of evaluation and assessment as well in the same place.
I never thought of that. I, I, I feel, sometimes I feel relieved that I'm like 15 years out of education, because if I were asking you these questions as a current educator, I would probably be exposing myself so much. At least this way I can be like, oh, back then. But
Today,
I'm back in the day. But what an amazing concept that, and I saw that too in my students. Like, as soon as they had a mark, it almost didn't matter how much feedback I gave. They just homed in on the grade. And
yeah,
had I, you know, maybe kept the grade to myself until a revised draft or something, right? I mean, that
yeah.
would have really sparked some improvement, I think.
Yeah, and if you keep a folder with a whole bunch of their writing and then you say, let's look through all your writing right now. Let's look at the first thing you wrote and the second thing you wrote, and then some later things. And you say, what happened? What improved? What's different? What do you like it more? Do you like it less? What have you changed about your approach? And that's an incredible assessment conversation
Yeah.
that, that's what we do here. When I even in the old system, I actually switched over from giving things a number along the way to just assessment feedback. And then towards the end of a course, when we had to come up with a mark because of the system that we're in, we would be talking about the degree to which they had mastered the concepts that I was required to evaluate in the course, but I didn't do it along the way. So I didn't say, let's take all of your marks on essays and average out the number, and that's your mark. I said, how are you doing now? How much have you mastered these things? And it was way better at the end than it was at the beginning. So I'm thinking, why on earth would I give them a mark that includes how they did at the beginning? That's got nothing to do with what they're able to do now. So that doesn't make any sense. That's like saying, your height is 3 feet because when you were born, you were really little. Like, it doesn't make any sense. Like, it doesn't give you any information about the person.
You have such good, this is part of your gift and strength as a teacher, is your ability to like grab awesome anecdotes and like plug them in for illustrative value. That was great. And it makes me wish, like, I don't think I have any of my old grade books anymore. And I never was digital. I was back in the sort of pen and paper days. But I tell you, especially near report cards, I remember sitting with, I used to assess a little and a lot, right? A little, but often, so that I had a huge bank of things that I could then average and
Yeah.
jimmy things around. Like, God, what happens if some of my old students are watching this, Jeff? I don't know. But it was always this ridiculously subjective, like, how much should I weight participation? Well, I don't know, maybe 10%. And what about quizzes? Well, they're quizzes and kids bomb the quizzes because they only learned okay, then maybe quizzes are 15%.
Yeah.
Like, it was just all so, yeah,
There's
cobbled
artificial.
together.
And it's funny because so you come up with these numbers and you wouldn't be happy about them because something isn't right. So then you try to make an adjustment and then you feel terrible about an adjustment because you messed with numbers. But you're the teacher. You're the person who actually knows the people and what they've learned. And what that is your teacher inside saying that number is not correct.
Yeah.
And so you try to figure out a way to justify it because you feel like math is the boss. And that's not even math. That's just adding. And so yeah, it's just the numbers push people around. When I talk to people about this method of doing things now, they say, well, what do you just pull a number from thin air? And it's like, I don't pull a number from thin air, but I certainly don't pull numbers from thin air every time I give someone an assignment like you do. Because, this quiz is out of 8, this thing's out of 10. They're like, yeah, well, we weight it. It's like, great. Well, what are you weighting? What does that mean? Like, what are you actually measuring? And if you if you take an assignment apart and say into its constituent parts and say, what were you testing? What were you finding out about? Quite often it's not what you think. I used to help departments undo their departmental wide, cross grade exams. Like, let's look at the, your social studies 10 exam. We'd pull it apart and kind of sort of deconstruct the test to say, how does this map out into the outcomes that it's measuring? And we find out it's measuring like a third of what you thought it is. The weight is skewed over here. So you're really not testing what you say you're testing anyway, half the time.
Okay, two questions. One, and you tell me which one you want to do first. One of my questions is, what would you prefer to see, like what's happening at teacher education programs right now in terms of helping people understand how to assess?
Yeah.
And what would you like to see? And the second question is, what about assessment as learning? Where do you want to go first?
Maybe I better do assessment as learning, because the other one I'm going to get all agitated.
Oh, good. I like it. We're getting hot under the collar today.
Yeah, absolutely. But I mean, and it won't take long, because assessment as learning is kind of like that next level, which is if you involve the learner in assessment, building assessment structure. And in our school, it's really easy because people design their own curriculum or co-construct it with a teacher. So when you design something, if you design it with assessment in mind at the front end, so someone said, I'm going to do a painting, and you say, okay, in this painting, how do you want to be assessed? Like, what are you working on? And the learner's like, I've never been asked a question like that in my life. And you're like, yeah, well, get used to it. So then they go, okay, well, I guess I really want to make sure that, I'm doing watercolor and I'm really trying to get my brush strokes right. And I'm trying to, stop it from bleeding into areas that I don't want. And I want it to be kind of the right balance between crispness and, that kind of stuff. And we co-develop a list of things or a number of things that they'd like to have us consider when we look at it. So rather than somebody handing something in and you just mark it based on a whole bunch of things, I might have 3 people hand me the same paper, but one of them writing it to me to say, I'd really like you to focus on my transitions. Another might be giving to say, I'd really want you to get me to focus on my vocabulary. And someone else might be handing and say, I really want you to focus on the way I do citations and if I've got the level right of where it's me versus what I've cited. And they could all get completely different assessment information back for exactly the same paper, depending on what its purpose was.
And that is reflective of what happens in the adult world or in the working world, because when I'm editing someone's book or when I'm editing a chapter or something, it's really important to understand what they want me to look for, right?
Absolutely,
Because there are 85 things that I could give feedback on, and that's really time consuming. However, if you want me to give feedback on your handling of dialogue or the believability of your characterization, that's more valuable to the person who's waiting for my feedback. And it's also more, I'm giving that feedback and therefore I know that it's going to be useful to the person. So it's a really nice targeted exchange.
Absolutely. I think it helps the learner to think about that as well, because they need to think about the purpose of what they're doing. So again, in school, if there's no purpose, why are you doing it? And so I don't want people to do things for no reason. I want them to do it for a reason. So I like to ask somebody, why are you doing this? How does it fit with your goals in your line of inquiry? What is it you're trying to figure out about the thing, yourself, your connection to the thing? Are you trying to build a skill? Are you trying to really understand a concept deeply? What is it? And how would you know? And then we talk about like indicators. So what would be some indications of depth in the area, that whatever it might be, a skill, a content, whatever it might be, not to the point of necessarily creating a rubric or anything, just kind of thinking about it. And then sometimes we don't even know what the indicators are until we get to the assessment conversation, but that's okay.
Yeah. Well, and what you're saying, like asking, why are you focusing on this? Why are you learning this?
Yeah.
That is a central question in business, right? Like there are many organizations that are in operation where employees, and often even into the directorship, people aren't actually certain of why are we doing this initiative. Sometimes people aren't even certain of why is our organization in existence. So that lack of self-reflective questioning, it could quite well be tracked back to coming up through a school system where you were never asked, like, why are you doing this?
Yeah,
And
absolutely. I think
and
it
for
is.
those, yeah, and those children who come out of the, you know, who arrive in this world as questioners, who ask, why are we doing this? They are often labeled troublesome or undesirable because they are courageous enough to, you know, to ask that really heavy duty question of like, what is the relevance to our betterment here?
Absolutely. That's so
Yeah.
true. Yeah. So, and we want those people, and even if they can think about it in an assessment way, if they are seen as a troublemaker, but they can explain their thinking, that can sometimes get them out of trouble. So that can work really well.
If they have an adult who's going to hold space for them to do that, right? Rather than just
Exactly.
jump to punishing.
Exactly. And if they get to learn that structure along the way, then they can advocate for themselves later in life because they've practiced with a bit of
Yeah,
scaffolding, which we talked about before.
that's
Um,
right.
but the other thing that you had asked about the teacher education part. So again, it's still like the assessment course that you take, the one course.
One, I took
Yep,
one. Did you
still
take
one.
one?
I took one.
I took
Um,
one.
it kind of came up a little bit in my practicum, but not really that much. And then unfortunately in BC, we use a piece of software called MyEdBC, which keeps track of all the demographics and all your stuff, final marks for things. And it has built in a grade book. And it is a grade book with names down the side, tasks across the top, a column for the numbers, a column for the weighting, and you put numbers in it. And it's the old grade book from the 50s.
The red ones with the coils, remember? They were all shrink wrapped, and like every
Doesn't buy them.
September there'd be stacks of them. Yeah, yeah.
You can still get them, and they look exactly the same. Nothing's changed. And the one on the computer is exactly the same as the one in the red spiral bound book. It's exactly the same. And then there's a whole bunch of other companies that have invented things that sometimes sound like they're more modern, but when you get down to it, it's still evaluating things. It's just putting things in boxes and adding the boxes up and coming up with numbers. It's for the most part. There's a few people that have tried to get out of that, but I would say that even the teachers who are using those products that can help you track things in a different way, I would say it's probably less than 10%.
Yeah.
So the status quo is still super powerful, and the free tools and the obvious tools out there are still pushing people into the worst assessment practices.
And what's really crazy is that often the biggest, like if I just sort of take a snapshot of a person who's in high school or recently graduated, they are holding on to two significant things about their experience in school. One, what was it like to share time and space with their peers? Was it positive, negative, etc.? Two, how smart am I? And the only way they have to actually get a handle on that idea is the marks that they were given.
Yeah, that's all they've got. They don't have there's nothing else to go on. They don't get any other information. Yeah.
So what needs to change?
It's funny. I mean, I would have said we just need more awareness about assessment, but like I said, we spent 20 years in BC talking about assessment. To me, our curriculum has to change. So we have an outcome-based curriculum, which quickly suggests to people that there are little granular items inside a big course, and you have to kind of check on each one of them. And it starts to push people very quickly into evaluation thinking as opposed to assessment thinking, because you're sort of thinking, have we, you'll hear this word, have we covered that?
Totally.
So as a teacher, it's about covering, and then as covering from a student's point of view, or how a teacher thinks of a student is, can I say that they got, a high enough mark in that to say that they did it? Although that doesn't even matter, because ultimately you add all the marks up and you get one big mark, and they might not understand anything about residential schools and municipal government, but other things got a big enough mark that they could still come out of it with an 80%. in a
Right.
social studies class. And it's like, great, that person got a really high B in a social studies class, and they have no idea about residential schools or how municipal government works. But you can't see that in the number. So
Right.
I think it's about, again, about a revisiting of like, what are we trying to do in school? Like, what is school for?
Yeah.
Is it for sifting and sorting, or is it for learning?
I would say, Jeff Hopkins, that like 70% of the world thinks it's sifting, sorting,
I think so too. I think
and
that's true.
stratifying. Yeah.
And it's funny because that's already done. Like, we don't need school to do that for us.
Yeah.
It's very easy. That part's easy. It's very easy to do that. You can create an online test for anything right now. You can sift and sort people in 5 seconds. Um, but if school was actually about learning, interestingly, you might have more people who sift out closer to the top, because you can actually teach people. But then I think there's also a built-in feeling that people are almost born into like a strata of some kind, like some level, as opposed to the neuroplasticity and the ability to learn, like we all know people actually do have.
So what, I mean, you are still at the Pacific School of Innovation and Inquiry at PSII. You are still bound by British Columbia curriculum, right? You
Yep,
teach differently, you approach learning differently. However, at the end of the day, you still need to, issue those marks.
right.
Are you saying that you in an ideal situation, you would do away with the marks entirely? Where do you stand on that?
Absolutely. Absolutely. They're
Okay.
absolutely extraneous. They have nothing to do with learning. They're a huge distraction.
Yeah.
And I think you're reducing a very complex activity, learning, to a number. And I think it's crazy. I think it's absolutely ridiculous. Like, I feel terrible when we actually have to assign a number to
Yeah.
something like learning. I just think it's terrible. And most people are kind of stressed out around that time because, like what you were saying, when you're looking at the numbers, you're saying, that doesn't feel quite right, but it doesn't feel right to change it. That's because it's a dumb thing to do. It's like, it's
Hey,
the
let's just
craziest
get that
thing.
out there.
It's crazy. So yeah, I would do away with it. What our learners end up with, and we've talked about this with the Ministry of Education before, is, what if a transcript, instead of being sort of a list of things and a list of numbers beside them, which is what a transcript is right now when you graduate, courses with marks, what if it was a little grid, like our little competency and context grid, um, and it was a little place where you could kind of look at any of the intersection points and see kind of what someone has mastered or how they would summarize their learning in those areas. Um, could you imagine if you were an employer or a university or
Mm.
a person who's going to lend somebody money to start a business, and you could see very quickly what someone had mastered, how they're demonstrating that mastery, and how they explain the mastery to you very clearly and succinctly, instead of, here's a thing with a bunch of numbers on it. You have no idea how I got those numbers, what those numbers really mean. Um, it doesn't really tell you anything at all.
Yeah. And so how close that sounds like educational utopia, right?
Yeah.
Like
Yep.
actually really being able to show what a learner, where her competency bases are and where her great strengths are,
Yep.
what she offers to herself and to her employer and to the people in her world. How far are we from that? Like, is there a way out of this marking hole?
I don't know. I mean, I don't know why, but I'm still tremendously optimistic. And the reason I say I don't know why is because I've had this conversation with, I don't know how many different deputy ministers, assistant deputy ministers, groups of people who come to hear me talk about it, and I don't know what they think about it half the time. Um, Everyone's nodding and smiling, and then nothing ever happens. So I don't know whether there's sort of a tipping point. I don't know whether there's some kind of like social capital that people feel they need to unload this on the public, and they don't feel like they have that yet.
I
I'm not
would
really.
say, oh, yeah, I would say that's operative. That part is definitely operative because, and you and I have talked about this and you've talked about it with a bazillion people, I imagine. Part of what is holding transformation back in the education system is the reluctance of adults such as you and I, who have already gone through school. And so we have that degree of familiarity with it, we've got parents who have gone through school and have a degree of familiarity. Like it's what is that phrase? It's the devil we know. And
Absolutely.
change is scary. So I think it's just that basic psychology that's really in our way.
Yeah, there's a little cartoon that I often show when I do a talk to people, and it's I wish I could remember the name of the artist, but I do have the artist's name when I show it. But it's got two little squares, and one of them, there's a person standing on a podium, a bunch of people in the audience, and the person on the podium says, "Who wants change?" Everybody puts up their hand. And the next frame he says, "Who wants to change?" And everybody puts down their hand.
Isn't that unreal?
Yeah, and it's unfortunately it's so real.
Yeah.
So when we have had about 120 people from UVic visit us this year by Zoom, and I kind of explain how the school works and show them around and talk to them about things. And a lot of the questions are how could you do that? And what do you mean you don't do such and such? And you can just see the horror for some people. And it's just kind of like, well, I guess that was our weird field trip for the day. And then other people, and you can see them, their eyes are lighting up and they're like, this exists. The world is going to be okay. And almost nothing in between. So I think it's very polarizing for people to say, we're going to change that thing you think you all know everything about school, and we're going to make it something completely, well, not completely unrecognizable, but really, really different.
Very different.
I'm not sure everybody's comfortable. Even people who have had a bad school experience. And when I was a superintendent in the Gulf Islands, there were a couple of parents who I talked to one time who were very concerned about how I was pushing things towards a constructivist approach in education, which kind of goes with inquiry learning. Yeah. And when it got down to it, after we had a real good conversation one day, I think we were outside of a grocery store or something, it came out that both of them had struggled so much in school and the school system, and had been made to feel so little by the system, that it was very hard for them to admit that all of that was for naught and was kind of arbitrary and didn't really need to be that way.
Oh, that is interesting. That is at the deepest level, hey?
Yeah, it's almost counterintuitive, but it was like, that terrible thing, if it's not really terrible, it didn't need to be terrible, then what happened to me was absolutely cruel. And you don't want to admit that, because that will make you feel pretty terrible about the world.
Well, and then you have a big box to unpack or to avoid in your psyche, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Wow.
Yeah. And I think the other side is that because we do say, if you got high 90s and everything, you're the one who gets to go on to the next exciting thing. Those people end up in positions that are typically, kind of important positions that make decisions about things. And so they're not going to change it, because the world they know and that got them to where they are is the world of 96%.
Yeah.
So it takes a little bit of discussion to get them to consider it as, maybe it wasn't about the 96%, maybe it was about what you knew how to do. Maybe that's what makes you successful.
So making change in this area is going to require, a shift in teacher education, so that, we're learning more early in our early adulthood, what's at play when we are assigning marks, versus assessing for and as and of learning. Yes. But also we need to sort of be more willing to look at our own experiences, at midlife and later life. We have to be willing to, and we cede it to ourselves inside all the time, but there's something about admitting it elsewhere that's very threatening. Or maybe some people don't even cede it to themselves inside, right? Like we are possessively hanging on to our inner thorns, not wanting anybody to show us something that we're not ready to see. I mean, this is a thorny thing.
Education too, I think we often get talked into, I've used this terminology before, but like the flavor of the week or the flavor of the year. And so, this year, professional development is about this. And next year, it's going to be about that. We dump that thing because that thing's no good anymore. It's old. But, so assessment, unfortunately, has been a little bit of a victim of that. And it's kind of been replaced by, this year, it's trauma-informed education. And that's the thing you have to do now. So
it's true.
Trauma-informed education would include really good assessment for learning. It wouldn't be evaluate everything because evaluation is a terrible thing to do to someone who's been traumatized.
Yeah.
But that's not what they mean when they say that, and we'll continue to evaluate people in our trauma-informed education system, which, you know, we just keep coming up with the next decoration to hang on the tree every year. I think we kind of got to look at the tree.
We do have to look at the tree, the roots, the stem, the bark, the whole thing.
Yeah, it's true. It's funny what you said about the teacher education program too, because when you think about the stem and the roots and the bark, when you were saying, you know, the teacher education program has to change, it has to change while you're in a program at university getting marks. So you're in your course about assessment getting a mark.
Yes.
And you better get a good mark or you're going to lose your scholarship or not graduate or, you know, whatever the case might be. So it's pretty funny when you're trying to learn about authentic assessment and you're maybe in a class where you do 3 assignments and they add them up and divide by the number and you get an average mark.
Yeah. Yeah, I hadn't thought of that. That's kind of a oxymoronic thing, isn't it?
I would say so, at least moronic. Yeah.
That's great. Good one. Okay, so what I wanted to say to people is that if they are curious about your assessment framework, this is the PSII competency framework. It is on the PSII website, which is www.learningstorm.org. And it's one of a number of really great resources that people can download and use. Please play with it, use it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it's going to point you to good assessment, because just used one an hour before this meeting, before this conversation, and it's so good because the learner leaves knowing what they need to do next to learn more towards goals that they've set with you. It's so good. It doesn't feel like you've done something kind of half-baked, or, you know, assessment shouldn't be a private act. It should be something that you do with the person who's learning, because that's who the assessment's actually for.
That's really true. Yeah. And we don't, you know, we don't approach it that way. Not all the time in the working sphere. And yet at school, it is very much I'm going to decide this, and then I will award this to you. And if you're lucky, I'll explain it to you.
Absolutely. That's right. Yeah. That's right. If you're lucky. Yeah, it's true.
So I think it would be great to get to a place where, you know, we can have children transferring from one learning level to another, you know, grades, just sort of with a very clearly depicted spread, almost, you know, like I'm just thinking somewhere in my mind, there's got to be a software that somebody's going to develop that will make all of this very easy, because at the moment it feels like it's qualitative, and that means, oh, there's probably going to be lots of reading, and so how does a university go through all these things? But you know, you already have a framework that kind of acts like a bit of a grid, right? Yep. So you can get a quick read.
We can give someone a one-pager that would give you a sense of where someone has developed depth, to what degree, for every competency as it meets each context. You could hand someone a piece of paper that would be no bigger or smaller or thicker or thinner than the one piece of paper that right now is their transcript.
Right.
You have to ask questions about it, and you'd have some things behind it. For us, that page would be the front page that, you know, you look behind it and you'd see all of the supporting information. If you look behind a transcript, you got nothing, because the mark books are gone. They went through the shredder at the end of June. There's no information, it's gone. You have no idea where that number came from if you wanted to. But ours is, we can show you exactly where it came from over like 4 years if you want.
Yeah. And how much more valid is that? We didn't even talk about validity and reliability, right? But that's much more valid than what we are currently engaged in the education system.
I think so, and transparent. Like it's both, definitely.
Cool. So this is your thinking around conviction 9, authentic and robust assessment of, for, and as learning is essential. That was a good one. I think a lot of people are going to have a lot of things to think about after this, including me.
I hope so. Yeah. I mean, I used to be on the dark side on this one. I learned over time and went, oh man, and I'm ashamed of my practice from previously. I really am. And I think a lot of us would be in that boat, because that's how we were taught to do this.
Yeah. Yeah. And you know what you just said was really important, because I think that's part of what is great about these conversations is that, you know, our willingness to, yeah, be like, yeah, when I look back, I could see how I was learning and growing and operating under some faulty paradigms perhaps. But here's, you know, there's somebody on Twitter said last night, like, you know, we need to be okay with changing our minds, right? Like,
Yeah.
instead of the wider world pointing fingers at people and saying, well, you didn't say that 5 years ago. 5 years ago, you said this, it's right here. Like,
Yeah.
let's
Yeah.
drop that, right? We are works in progress. We are continually learning, and continually casting off things that no longer serve us. That's what we want for our children and our learners. So we need to make space for that for ourselves. And the first part of doing that is forgiving ourselves for being jerks earlier in our careers, for being, like you said, you're on the dark side, you're a bad guy sometimes. And so was I. Boy, you know, I had kids writing lines on the board, for goodness sake, when I first graduated. Like, yeah. So just being able to be like, okay, this isn't the way, this isn't the best way. I'm not perfect, I'm still learning. What's next?
Yep. It's okay. Yeah, just surface it and move on. Like, if you're going in the right, it's, you know, if you're going in the right direction, that's way more important than any snapshot along the way. You know, it's a marathon. It's not a sprint. So a
It is.
snapshot isn't going to tell you about the marathon.
Yeah, cool. Jeff, always so good to talk with you. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. And we're just going to keep rolling it out because there's lots to talk about here. We'll see you next time.
See ya.